Good morning. It is the 5th of March, and we are in the middle part of Lent 2024. And we're going to talk today once again, about that bizarre meeting that happened in last month in February in Rome, where a couple of high ranking bishops and cardinals of the church working in the Roman Curia decided that meeting with the stonecutters, as we have to call them around here, was a good idea. And not only was it a good idea, that they decided to open up pathways of dialogue and inclusion to them, citing even fiducia supplicans and other things. It was one of the weirdest stories, bizarre stories. And we even saw that in the press conference after that meeting, the bishop who was supposed to be the big voice of reason, who was there to teach about all the church's anathemas on that stuff, that he had actually decided to full throat endorse them. Kind of a weird thing to do. We saw them in the aftermath of this, though. That same bishop actually returned to a more Catholic position on that organization, possibly because he got a talking to from somebody high up in Rome, somebody higher up than himself. And it was inevitable that there would be a backlash to this, and not just from loudmouth laity like myself, but actual people who matter on this, such as, I don't know, priests and bishops. So we're going to talk a little bit about where some of this comes from. So some exorcists have spoken up about this and how it's a really bad idea, but a high-ranking priest, and by a high-ranking, I mean a fairly influential priest that I have brought to you his work before, had quite a lot to say. Oh, let's take a look in the live checks. He's getting very active in there. So good morning to everybody. Immaculatus has asked for prayers. They've been without a job for 3 months and 3 days now. So please pray that that situation is resolved positively for them and soon. So LifeSite News published this piece with the headline of Exorcist warns involvement in stonecuttery exposes the soul to the demonic. Monsignor Charles Pope, a seasoned priest in exorcism and deliverance ministry, criticized public dialogue among prelates in that group, emphasizing the grave sin and spiritual danger of their way, which he says invites demonic influence. And for those who are wondering, you can't say the name of that group on this platform without getting into some trouble. I know that sounds weird, but I've been doing this a long time. I learned it the hard way. So here's what Monsignor Charles Pope had to say about this. I've brought over the years, I've had like public letters of his like 2 or 3 times in the public over the several years. He's what we would call kind of a conservative in the new order of things in the church, not really a traditionalist. There is a difference. There is. For those who don't like those kind of labels, well, there is a difference, and labels matter for these things. So here he says on the foolishness of public dialogue with the stonecutters, quote, commenting on the proposal to open up dialogue between the church and that group, Monsignor Charles Pope, who has been involved in deliverance ministry for decades at the St. Michael's Center for Spiritual Renewal, based in Washington, D.C., told LifeSite News that it was utterly foolish for the church to try to dialogue with that organization. He said this was for 2 reasons. First, he gives the impression that being involved in that organization is no big deal, undermining Catholic teaching that being part of it is gravely sinful and spiritually dangerous, incurring the penalty of an automatic excommunication. Monsignor Pope affirmed that involvement in stonecuttery exposes the soul to the demonic. Second, Monsignor Pope said that if any dialogue is engaged in with sinners, it should be private, not a public conversation. Public discussions only create confusion and scandal, he insisted. Let's hold here. That's like just general good advice. I remember when a certain Speaker of the House who was Catholic a few years ago, that person is no longer in that position, had been barred formally from receiving the Eucharist by her Archbishop Cordileone of the San Francisco area, and she railed against him publicly. National Catholic Reporter, American Magazine, all railed against him publicly, and then she very publicly received the Eucharist at Mass in the Vatican. You remember the storm that caused? Same kind of thing here. Okay, if you're going to have dialogue with people, with organizations that are not good, it should be done privately if you're going to do it at all. However, in this case, the only kind of dialogue that should happen is with bishops and priests and even the Pope telling them to repent, leave the organization, leave what they're doing, and come back to God. That should be what they're doing. But unfortunately, that's not how it works in Rome. Modernist Rome was really into this idea that we can just talk and come to some mutual understanding and live in harmony and have a hug and share some brownies or something. That's what they believe. That is abundantly clear from the nonsense that they spew and how they almost never call anybody to penance and repentance, except for those of us who really want to cling hard and fast to the traditional faith, no matter how uncomfortable that traditional faith makes the world today. Anyway, we'll continue. Monsignor Pope explained that in exorcisms and deliverance ministry, the possessions associated with that organization and obsessions are extremely serious, involving generational curses stemming from vows pronounced by a man during their rituals. Now, again, we pause here because usually this generational stuff we associate with Father Ripperger, not with Monsignor Charles Pope. And Father Ripperger has gotten a lot of pushback for holding to this, but again, it is something the church held to until recently, where we don't take spiritual consequences for our actions all that seriously anymore, both as laity and as the hierarchy. We are in a phase of institutionalized lukewarmness. That's where we are. And that is looking at this stuff with like extreme skepticism. I don't advise it because I've got something from another exorcist here that we'll talk about in a minute, where he goes over several examples of this. Anyway, Monsignor Charles Pope said that such curses sometimes remain for up to 7 generations, and that in deliverance ministry, as such, were discovered to be far more frequent than at first imagined. He added that given the frequency of such curses and the near impossibility of tracing stonecutter involvement back 7 generations, at the St. Michael Center, prayers of deliverance for demonic possession and possession include, as a matter of course, the renunciation of such vows and the breaking of such curses. Pardon me. I'm not sure what's going on here. Which is accomplished after 3 days of intense prayer. All right, so let's hold on here. I'm going to mute myself for. All right, we're back. I don't know what's going on. Maybe a certain sulfur smelling person doesn't like what we're talking about here. But let's talk about some Exorcist stories. So Monsignor Pope's testimony was corroborated by Monsignor Stephen Rossetti, the founder of the St. Michael Center and himself an exorcist. And he has published several stories of demonic possession and obsession resulting from such curses. The incidences are related in a blog post series called Diary of an Exorcist, and you can find all these here. I'm just going to go over like 1 or 2 of these. There's a whole lot. Let me show you how many. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, okay? There's a lot of these, and that's just what they feature in this article. He has a whole website dedicated to this stuff, and stonecutters show up a lot on that website. So, for example, detailing the struggle of a man facing demonic activity related to his love of strong drink and the obstacles the exorcist ran into in trying to expel the demon, Rossetti writes in the entry titled number 233, quote, however, it seemed to the exorcist that there was something blocking full liberation. The sessions were not being fully effective. On an inspiration, the exorcist asked James, is there any stonecuttery or other secretive involvement in your family background? The man named James responded, my grandfather had attained level 33 of that organization. So the exorcist took James through the prayers to lift any curse relating to that organization, plus any other generational curses. In the next session, James experienced great relief. He said it was almost like a switch turned and he was liberated. It has been several years now and the demons have not returned. He is happily married and practicing the faith. In a previous diary, he details the experience of a family, basically, that had this stuff in their background. It says in this one situation, a family of 4 with symptoms of demonic oppression came for help. Trying to find the cause, he finally asked, did you or any members of your family ever belong to that group? They had some symptoms which were typical of such curses, and the father responded, yes, that he joined, but was for social purposes. In each of these cases and many others, people were well-intentioned, yet all of them made their situations worse by engaging in public practices or forbidden practices. Regarding these, the Catholic Church has given explicit public warnings. The Holy See has forbidden membership in these associations, and as recent as 1983 went so far as to state the faithful who enroll in such associations are in a state of grave sin. The priest continues, while some might view these documents as examples of ecclesiastical heavy-handedness or an overreaction, our direct experience suggests that they are timely warnings for our protection. At root, the commandments of God and the teachings of the church are designed to keep us safe and are guideposts for a successful journey to the kingdom. Humble obedience is a great protection and a powerful weapon in casting out evil. Now, this is like heavy stuff. When you look at what happens to just normal people, and I want to remind you of something else that came up in my mind when going over this material. We hear from Father Ripperger and other exorcists that in the last 60 years that exorcisms have become much harder, and in the last few years in particular, they've become even harder. And I have to wonder: is it because of a rise in membership of that organization, or is it because of a rise in people playing around with dark things they shouldn't be playing with? Or is it because a fair number of members of the hierarchy have joined such organizations? And another article here that I don't know if we'll have time to get to or not, but there's a former member of one of those groups who repented of it and left. And he says he never personally knew any members of the clergy or any bishops who were part of the organization, but he had heard stories. He says it's extremely plausible that several members of the hierarchy in Rome would be part of this because Rome is a hotbed for this stuff. And why do you think Rome is a hotbed for this stuff? Because stonecutters have always had their eyes on the church. That's why Rome is a hotbed, just like London is a hotbed, because London has been a financial center of the Western world for hundreds of years. Let's take a quick look at the live chat before we continue. Daniel says the peculiar thing about that group is that the organization has managed to transcend culture and geography. It operates practically everywhere in the world. Why is it so alluring? Because of connections, because a lot of people join for the professional and financial connections it affords them. That's why. Damien Killer reminds us that group has been making Catholic medals with their symbols on them too. Beware of this development. They are bad news. Yes, they are. That is true. That has been documented several times. You just do a simple Google search for exorcist and stonecutter or by their name, you'll find all over. You'll find articles talking about that, and some of the articles poo-pooing the warning, of course. Cindy Rose asks, is it because of the exorcism time being harder that there seems to be no actual distinction of good and evil in the mind of our Pope? That's one thesis. I imagine someone who holds to the impeded see thesis would be that because essentially the power of the Holy See is restrained by the fact that there is a pretender of the throne. That's what they would say. And you can come up with any variation that you like for the other options. Go ahead and hit like if you haven't. It does help, by the way. Let's see. Fun fact, Robert Richards says about that group, you know what they call the ladies in charge? Yeah, there's a whole group of them out there. Oh, thank you for the super chat. Where did that go? Okay. Thank you for the super chat, David and Melissa. It's appreciated. Says Father Carlos Martin says it's because use of the smaller number of believers, fewer people worship in the church. Yeah, that's probably why. That's probably a very good reason why. I suspect it's a multifactorial kind of thing for why exorcisms aren't as powerful as they used to be. And that exorcisms take much longer than they used to. But the declining number of people going to mass absolutely has to be part of it, and a big part of it. And it probably doesn't help to having this kind of ambiguity in the things going on in the church in general. Yeah, hit like if you haven't. It does help us with the with YouTube algorithm. So. But here we go with, I think, one of the more, this is not even a new warning. I mean, in 2016, 8 years ago, Bishop Schneider gave an interview for 1 Peter 5. He talked about the influence of this organization and how it's just explicitly not compatible with the faith. Like, I can't believe we're having to talk about this because elements of the Holy See now want to dialogue with everybody. And that organization, by the way, congratulated Jorge Bergoglio when he became Pope Francis. They congratulated him for it and have over the years several times said they think very highly of him. Okay, so maybe that's why we have to talk about this, because we have this era at the very least of permissiveness and downplaying sin and the reality of sin, and essentially relativism, which, as we'll see from Schneider here, is kind of the key to understanding why that organization and their efforts are so harmful to not only the church, but to the world. So goes the church, so goes the world, as they say. So here's what Bishop Schneider had to say. He says that organization is in itself intrinsically not compatible with Christian or Catholic faith. If it is intrinsically not compatible, because the nature of that organization is anti-Christian. They deny Christ, and they deny the objective truths. They promote relativism, which is contrary to the truth to the gospel. So they promote the doctrinal errors of that philosophy. This is incompatible with Christian and Catholic faith. Stonecuttery has also an esoteric aspect, which is not Christian. They have rituals and ceremonies which are hidden, which they openly admit, and such ceremonials are contrary to the faith. Their symbols and rituals demonstrate that they are against the divine truths in the gospel. These things transmit show that Stonecuttery is another religion. I repeat, it is another religion. It is an antichrist religion. Even when they do good works, philanthropy and so forth, these dangerous things remain. Their philanthropy is not a justification that we can accept them just because of their good philanthropic work. I will never recognize their doctrines and rituals which are against the divine truths of the gospel. The church can never accept this. The Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith's 1983 declaration on it is still valid. According to this declaration, it is a mortal sin to join them. Even Pope Francis has not changed this law. This teaching is official and still valid. And it still remains. God willing, it will still remain. That Francis will never go that far. I mean, if he does that, I would like to think that a lot more people will finally be willing to admit that there is something very seriously wrong in Rome. His interviewer asks him in 2013 on his return flight from Rio, Pope Francis made reference to a lobby of that group. Recently, Cardinal Ravasi in the Italian paper Il Sole 24 Ore called for new dialogue and shared values with that organization. Has that organization won in the church? This was 2016. 2016, where people were talking about dialogue with that group. 2016. Schneider's response. Of course, we know that that organization is one of the most powerful influences at all levels of human society. This is manifest and clear. Theoretically, when one is a supporter, a leader in a very influential anti-Christian organization, there is the tendency to infiltrate the organization, which is your enemy. It is very logical. So it is logical over many centuries that they would have tried and probably succeeded to infiltrate themselves into various levels of the church. This is clear to me. It is difficult to demonstrate concretely, to identify who is a member. It is very difficult and dangerous because someone may be accused of being a member, then it is proved the person is not formally a member. It is because of the secrecy and esotericism of the group that makes it very difficult. One can assume that a cleric, a priest, bishop, or cardinal has some connections with the organization by his speech. We hear clerics speaking like them clearly when they open their mouths. They use terms and concepts that are typically of the Stonecuttery. He could be a member, but you have to prove it. But at least when he speaks, he has the spirit of them. Maybe he's not a formal member, but some bishops and cardinals speak clearly with their spirit. I stress this does not mean that they are formally members of the organization. Again, that might be why exorcists are having such a hard time. Because in spirit, many of them are like that already. In the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, a document published by that group and found by almost happenstance by the Holy See, and numerous popes spent money out of their own family fortunes to get this thing published in several languages and disseminated to the bishops of the world. They said their goal was not to have a formal member of theirs be the Pope, but to have one who is essentially spiritually a member of theirs, who promotes their ideas and it becomes their biggest cheerleader on the world stage. And that's where we are now. They got what they wanted. In fact, some would definitely argue that Francis wasn't even the first like him, that his predecessors were like that too, going back to the 60s. And why is that? Because we have a permanent aggiornamento in the church now, a permanent revolution and a season of change in the church where things are getting more and more and more secularized. It was 1960s when Paul VI stood up at the United Nations and told them that the church was at their service. Okay, that happened. Francis isn't the first. There was a theologian who wrote a book. He passed away 30 years ago, but his book was called Athanasius and the Church of Our Time. He quotes from a letter written by a stonecutter in 1839. He says, Stonecutter said, quote, "We must not individualize vice. In order for it to grow to the proportions of patriotism and enmity towards the church, we must generalize it. Catholicism is no more afraid of a sharp dagger than the monarchy is, but these two foundations of the social order are likely to collapse through corruption. Let's pause there. What monarchs are still around? What strong monarchs are still around? None. They're all, virtually all of them are symbolic now. They're still being there means they could be restored fully someday, but the monarchies are functionally gone. Now, what about the papacy? Now, think about that. We, at all events, never allow ourselves to be corrupted. Do not then let us make martyrs, but let us popularize vice among the masses. Whatever their five senses strive after shall be satisfied. Create hearts full of vice, and you will no longer have any Catholics. That is the corruption on a large scale which we have undertaken. The corruption of the people by the clergy, and that of the clergy by us. The corruption which leads the way to our digging the church's grave. Words of a stonecutter with what they were wanting. And now you have much of these vices being promoted by men who are ostensibly in the church, who have formal positions in the church. David Wilson, yeah, there's been long been whispers that John the 23rd was actually a member of that organization. I tend to wonder, though. Daniel says there are so many potential hazards that Catholics need to worry about. I feel like I've been living under a rock for decades. Well, understand it this way. The devil has his sights on the Catholic Church, and for a good reason. It's the church founded by Christ on the rock of Peter. That's why. Fulton Sheen once said that if he was not a Catholic already, if he was looking for the true faith, he would look for the one that the world hates. Well, this is the one. This is also the one that the demons hate. Go figure. Who is the prince of the world again? But yeah, so I want to now bring this to a former member of one of these organizations. He's asked a few questions here in an interview for the National Catholic Register. In this article here, when was this published? This was published 4 years ago. Okay, so for some reason this has kept coming up in the last few years in the church, partially because I think Francis has talks off and on about how thanks them for their endorsements and things, as if that's a good thing, while then later on saying, well, you can't be a member of that organization. It's like, you can't have it both ways, right? But this person had decided to leave the organization after a staggering conversion that he experienced at a Marian shrine in Lourdes. Here's how what his conversion was, and I want to remind you that one of the Hammer of Heresies and Destroyer of Heresies is one of the titles of Our Lady and of Saint Joseph, also Hammer of Heretics. You can, if you know people in your life who are associated with this organization, you should pray a novena involving those saints for their conversion. This person had a profound conversion at the Lourdes, and it caused him to leave. He has some interesting things to say here. He says, the first step of my conversion happened before a statue of Saint Therese of Lisieux at Narbonne Cathedral. My son was in trouble and I was going through a difficult time. One day I decided to go to the cathedral that was next to my office to pray. Soon after, I told my wife it would be nice to go to Lourdes to pray a little for me and my son. I didn't have the faith I have now at the time, but a small ray was already arising in me when I decided to go to Lourdes. There I went to the grotto and prayed a whole rosary for the first time. At the end of the prayer, as I got up, my legs gave out under me and I felt paralyzed. I saw a strong light coming out of the statue of the Virgin Mary. Some people around tried to help me to my feet, but my legs stayed and paralyzed for many minutes. I've been through an incredible experience. I initially didn't tell my wife because I wanted to do a few medical analyses first. It turned out that nothing was wrong with me. I saw a psychiatrist to make sure I wasn't having some kind of mystic delirium, and he found I was sane. I didn't completely understand what happened to me right away, but I felt that God had entered my life and that everything was in me was about to change forever. I made a retreat soon after, and everything made sense. This is how my real life of faith began. I heard a priest say that sometimes God lets Satan act so that satanic temptations and axes can contribute to the man's salvation, with a human being's will, of course. I believe it is an answer to the question of evil. And he didn't leave them right away, though. When he went back to the group, he started feeling that this activity was not in line with his faith. He slowly began stopping attending the meetings. He lost connections to the people, which is expected. But he does mention that one of these things here And when he says, have you ever seen any clergymen in the houses there? He says, not personally, but I've heard of some cases. He says he cannot testify personally, but it's very likely that representatives from the church belong to the organization. Spanish historian Alberto Barchena dedicated a book to this topic in 2016. If you want to find these books that are mentioned in these interviews, I'll have all this in my show notes at returntotradition.org just a few minutes before the video that's going to go live in about an hour. There's one thing that needs to be reiterated here, though. Whoever more, we'll call it in the traditional sphere you look at, who warns against this stuff, Exorcist, Malachi Martin, they all say it goes back to Lucifer, that this is what they serve. I know there are some who say, oh, no, that's not true. This is that. Even former members apparently say that for some reason. But you see this consistently in other former members. And here's this person's testimony. He says, one day when I was an officer in the house of, I'm going to try to pronounce that. He said, I heard a first grade ritual that I never heard before that pays tribute to Lucifer. It's also part of probably the biggest group among them. He says, I heard the Venerable Master say, we must thank Lucifer for bringing light to men. I was quite taken aback. This ritual, in that way in general, considers that religions, and Catholicism in particular, obscure the truth to believers and keep it to themselves, while the stonecutters provide keys to human beings so they can fully free themselves. Furthermore, in my last two books, I quoted extracts of a document that is accessible only to high-grade members, so the so-called blue houses, which gather the new members, don't have access to it. This is taken from another book of theirs, whose name I won't try to pronounce, a publication issued by his former group, in which are compiled the best written texts regarding societal issues or their rituals, and that are on display in those houses. In these 3 or 4 page document, there's a text that praises transgression, and the one that allowed it, Lucifer. It is worth noting that the stonecutters usually mention Lucifer rather than Satan. So, yeah, you got a former member, and his name is Sergei Abad Galardo. There's somebody else that often says the same stuff too, that former members, including some on YouTube for some reason, say, no, they're all citing this guy who says from Lucifer. Well, this one does says the same thing too, as do other former members. It is all from Lucifer. All right. So, folks, there are your warnings from exorcists and even a former member. This is timely, and I'm glad that Monsignor Charles Pope really kicked this off with that interview we started with, because it's needed. Clearly, the Vatican at this point has lost the plot when they're openly talking about having meetings with these groups. They should know better. They really should know better. But for some reason, they refuse. They refuse to acknowledge that what they do is, at the very least, undermines the credibility of the church and causes consternation among the faithful. At the very least, if no consideration for their own personal well-being is included here, but those who try to dialogue with them are taking a great risk. Unless, of course, they don't mean dialoguing. Unless, of course, those prelates have already joined them. And that is a very distinct possibility. One of them was Cardinal Coco Palmiro, aka Cardinal Coco Puffs, as I call him, who has long since been thought to be a member of that group. David Wilson reminds us that slack doctrine weakens the mind. That is very, very, very true. This is why we always say that the response to being critiqued for being rigid is to cling to the cross, cling to the faith, as it has always been taught. I'm going to paraphrase Pius XII. I don't have the quote in front of me here, but he always warns us to be wary of those who bring up words like clericalism and rigidity all the time. That any prelate who does that is not to be trusted, because the faith is supposed to be rigid. That's the point. But as Grasshopper says, be not afraid. Jesus loves us all. And please have a safe flight. Say an Ave for him, later. Him or her. All right, folks. Imagine how long Cardinal Gagnon's list would be today. Yeah. I don't want to think about that. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. And as always, pray for the church. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition with that join button or Patreon or subscribe star, now's a great time to do it. It does help keep these messages coming. Share this on social media if you can. It does help too. Again, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.